What are you guys' issues with raising private money? Fatty and I have raised probably 130 million. North of 150 million dollars. Like it's a lot. We've raised a lot of money. And this is like, we've never had any institutional equity or anything like that. It's always been from mom and pop investors in 100,000 to a couple $1 million increments. So if you guys want to go out and raise money, like, we can offer some insight. So what are your big issues with raising private money right now? So let's give a hypothetical. 50 units, let's call it $100,000 a unit. Let's call it a $5 million deal. Does that sound good? 5 million, 50 units. So on this, Litzer's not here yet, right? What are banks lending at? Because of interest rates right now, and then up a little bit, debt service coverage ratio, which means like, you guys know what a DSCR is? So if your net income needs to be at least 1.2 times whatever your debt service is. So if your debt service is $100,000 a year, you need to be bringing in $120,000 a year. That's the DSCR, 1.2 times. So because interest rates are more expensive, that means the cost of capital is more expensive, which means the DSCR doesn't cover as well. So you're not getting as much leverage. You're not getting as high of an LTV as you might have gotten a couple of years ago when rates were lower. So like I might have been able to get an 80 or maybe even 85% loan from a bank a couple of years ago. Today, let's call it a 70% loan. It's probably somewhere in the 60 to 70% LTV. So let's say I'm gonna get a bank loan for $3.5 million. That means I need LP, limited partners, my equity investors, are gonna bring $1.5 million. Now that's just down payment. That does not include any sort of acquisition fee you're gonna take, and it does not include any sort of closing costs that are associated with that. So likely on this deal, let's say you're gonna take a 3% acquisition fee, that's 150 grand, and you're gonna, there's gonna be 2% of closing costs. So that's another $100,000. So it's about a $250,000. So really, you need to raise about $1.75 million. Everybody following me so far, right? On that $1.75 million, my goal is to get my investors somewhere in the high teens to 20% annualized return on their investment, okay? So this deal, I might be buying it for $5 million, but I'm gonna get a pro forma of what this is gonna look like over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. So a lot of times I ask Chris Litzler and his team to put it together for me. Here's what the rents are currently. Here's where they're going to be. If I raise them by 3% every year, which is pretty normal, but we also add 2% per year to the expenses. Overall, let's say that the value of this thing, and I wish I did a printout or something for you guys to show you, but let's say 5 years from now, this thing is worth, let's call it $6 million, okay? And let's say that it's fairly stabilized where it's cash flow positive right now, and I can pay an 8% return to my investors on it. So my LPs, I pay in essentially 3 different ways. One is a preferred return. And on that preferred return, I'm gonna pay them 8% per year. And by the way, I raise money in $100,000 increments, so minimum 100,000. And so in this scenario, in order to raise 1.75, I'd have 17 and a half units that I'd be raising money on. You guys following me? 17.5. So somebody can come in for 1 unit, somebody could come in for 2 units, somebody could come in for 3.5 units. As long as they're in for at least 1 unit, then I don't care what the increment is beyond that. But 100K, and I'm gonna do this at a 100K increment. So first is the preferred return, which means they'd make $8,000 per year on their money. Second thing is, when the revenue comes in on a building, first thing you pay for is the operating expenses, taxes, insurance, utilities, maintenance, and management. Second thing is the mortgage for the senior debt. The third thing that gets paid is this preferred return. And then if there's any excess cash flow beyond that, that gets split. Let's say I'm going to do a 50-50 split with my investors. So let's say I'm giving up 50% of the deal for this $1.75 million. And I usually keep a couple $100,000 to be able to raise later if I need to. So let's say I'm going to have 17 and a half units, but I'm going to divide it out by 20 units just to be safe. So take 0.5, which is 50%, divided by 20. Yep. So for every 100K that somebody brings in, they're going to get 2.5% equity in the deal. Do you guys see how I just did that? Does anybody have questions on that? So if they bring $100,000, they get 2.5% equity. If they write $1 million check, they'd have 25% equity. Following me?
One more time.
I took 50% of the deal,
Yep.
and I'm going to raise $2 million for that 50%. So if I divide out 50% of a deal by 20 different increments, it's 2.5% for every $100,000 invested, right? So 100 grand, 100 grand, 100 grand, 100 grand, and there's 20 of us in here that each throw 100 grand in. That would equate, we would get as the LPs 50% of that deal. Okay? So all I did is I was doing a 50-50 split, and then because I'm going to have 20 different units, each unit would be worth 2.5% equity. The other thing you could do, and what most other syndicators do, and what most other multifamily coaches teach, is if you're giving up 50%, whether you have to raise 1.75 million, or even if that balloons to $3 million, you just dilute this tranche of LP investors, and everybody's equity goes down. I don't do it that way, but you could do it that way. Okay? So if I screw up the capital raise, because I screw up the operating expenses, the CapEx, if I miss something on due diligence or whatever, I dilute my equity and not my LP's equity. So I would reduce my share from 55% down to 50, down to 45, and the LPs who originally came in, Mark writes me a check for 100 grand, and I screwed something up. It's not right for me to dilute his equity further, because he did his part. I didn't do my part, right? So I dilute my equity. I think that's a more fair way of doing it. So for every $100,000 that somebody brings, they're going to get 2.5% equity in the deal. If they bring more money than 100 grand, then they just, Roush is writing me a check for $1 million. They would then get 10 times this amount because they gave me 10 units. So they're going to get 25% equity in this single deal. And they'll still make 8% on their $1 million. So instead of 8 grand, they're going to make 80 grand per year. Make sense? Yep. Cool. So this equity kicks off 2.5%. If there is excess cash flow above and beyond the mortgage and the preferred returns, they'd also get 2.5% of any excess cash flow. So if it brought in another $10,000 of positive cash flow a month, they get an extra $250 a month for every unit that they owned. Okay? They also get depreciation, means they get 2.5% of the depreciation. I don't really, I put it in there, but I don't really quantify what this can do. I just let them know that on this $5 million building, we're planning on doing a cost seg. We can probably depreciate around $1 million in the first year, and on that $1 million, you're going to get about 2.5%, which is $25,000 of depreciation in year one, right? This is ballpark. We don't have the cost seg done yet, but that's about what that is.
And is that always 2.5%, or is it just matching whatever?
It matches this, whatever their equity is. They get 2.5% of depreciation, 2.5% of cash flow, and 2.5% of equity growth. So that means if we sell it for $6 million in 5 years from now, they get 2.5% of that $1 million. So this is what it looks like. Over the course of a 5-year term, they make 8% on their money, so $8,000 per year. And so here's how I add it up. So pref is 8K times 5 years equals how much? $40,000 of preferred returns. Then cash flow. Let's say the cash flow is $1,500 a year over the course of 5 years. What is that, $7,500? All right, I'm ballparking numbers here, guys, right? I use $100 per unit per month of cash flow, and they get 2.5% of that. So they would get $1,500, and this is actual distributions that get paid out. So really, they're making 9.5% cash on cash return of actual cash. Then depreciation, I don't add up in this. I just let them know it'll offset 25 grand of their tax liability, and whatever tax bracket they're in, they're going to save a couple bucks. And then equity. That equity of $1 million when we go to sell, they get 2.5% of that, which is around $25,000, right? So what's 40 plus 25, 65, plus 7.5, 72.5? So 72.5 of total value ROI. Total value return on investment was $72,500. And can you divide that by 5, please? So in this scenario, if I structured it exactly like this, it's 14.5.
Yeah.
It would be 14.5% annualized return on investment. So that to me seems a little bit light, right? I want to get my investors into that like 18, 17, 18, 15 to 20% I think is very, very fair. So I might give up 60% of the equity, so that way they get 30 grand instead of 25. And then that boosts this to 75.5. So then that jumps it to 15.1% annualized. And then maybe I say, hey, the cash flow's tight on this thing. Like this is the most I could pay in cash flow. But let me do this instead. I'll pay 8% as we go. And then I'll do 2% accrued. This is whatever you pay as we go is called paid current. And then whatever you wait and add up at the end might be accrued. So then I'll take that other 2% times 100 grand times 5 years is $10,000. So now I just made this 50K and took this to 85.5. Now 85.5 divided by 5. 17 what? 17.1. 0.1%. So now I got them a 17% annualized return on their investment. I was able to play around with the numbers a little bit to make sure my investors get what they want, right? And at the same time, it meets the needs of the property and doesn't stress the cash flow of the property.